So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you sort of an overview of some of the cybersecurity technology and techniques that you can use to defend your systems in various ways. But I'm going to do that in the context of elections, and it's important to first understand what your role is, and also to understand what an adversary is trying to accomplish. So I start by asking the question, who's responsible for protecting our elections? And really, we all are. We're all responsible, but some of us will have a greater impact in defending against certain kinds of attacks, depending upon the particular parts of the system that we have the greatest responsibility for maintaining. Now, let's look now at what an adversary might be trying to accomplish. Well, the goal of the adversary is to disrupt an election, but what does that really mean? It can be a couple of things. We can go to the third column, and this is sort of the obvious thing. They might be wanting to manipulate vote tallies so that the outcome of the election is actually different than what is representative of the votes that were cast. And they can try to accomplish this through many means. They can attack the voter registration system so that you have ineligible or non-existent voters or even dead voters that are able to cast their votes. It could be through subversion of voting systems themselves, malicious software, other things that might change the voting equipment or the tabulating equipment. It could be attempts to intercept communications between the polling locations and the central locations, or even subverting election staff. Now, fortunately, we have not seen adversaries being successful in this kind of attack, and we'll talk a little bit about why that might be, but why we are still in danger. But given that the adversaries have had difficulty actually manipulating the vote tallies, they shift their focus to maybe something that is a little bit easier for them to do. And that's what we see in the first column here, manipulating voters. Now, manipulation of voters can occur in many ways. It could be through collecting detailed information about voters, maybe through Facebook, by way of Cambridge Analytica, which we saw in 2016, and using that to send very different messaging to different segments of the population, much of that messaging being potentially false. So this is one way to manipulate the views of the voters. It could also be hacking into systems of political campaigns or political organizations, as we saw with the DNC email hacks, which were released to WikiLeaks. And that was intended to, in some sense, also influence the view of voters. Sometimes it's simply creating confusion among voters, both about the positions of candidates, but maybe more importantly about the procedures of the election itself. And that moves us into sort of the next column. Imagine, for example, you target a subset of voters, those in a particular precinct that might be expected to vote against your interests, and you tell them that their polling locations have changed. So they show up on election day, they don't find a polling location. Yeah, they can go back and try to find out what the correct information is, but it might be late in the day. They might not have the time to do that. That actually ends up discouraging or preventing voting. Or maybe it's the procedures for submitting vote by mail ballots. You tell people that, oh, you need to do this or that, or you don't need to do something else, so that those ballots ultimately end up being disqualified. All measures that might discourage or prevent the actual tallying of votes. Now, there are many ways that they may do this. It could be through manipulation of voter rolls. Again, this time, an individual shows up, they're told you're not in the rolls. They're given the option to submit a provisional ballot, but that takes more time. It creates some other issues, and many voters will give up at that point, not cast their vote. I already told you about sending out incorrect poll locations or even dates. It could also be a cyber attack on a particular precinct polling location to create what we call a denial of service attack, maybe caused by a forced power grid attack in that area, or maybe through other means. And if your polling location isn't able to accept your votes, the lines grow. And after a little bit of time, voters turn away because they don't want to wait in those long lines. So we see here these first three columns here: manipulating vote tallies directly, manipulating voters, and discouraging and preventing voting, all of which have a significant impact on the actual correct tallies of votes, whether it is what votes were actually cast or the counting of those. But of course, there are other things an adversary may attempt to accomplish. And that, what we see in the fourth column, is simply creating distrust in the outcome of the election. The adversary doesn't need to change the outcome. They can instead produce disinformation regarding incidents and trying to give the appearance that there was much more widespread fraud than actually occurred. It could be attacks on news and media sites to create errors in the initial published returns, so that when the correct returns come out the next day, or it tends to be now, weeks and weeks later, after things go along, people start to wonder, well, why did things change after the initial return? It could also be, as we said, demonstrating the hacks and fraud in some districts and trying to give the impression that it's more widespread. This is something that we've seen in spades since the 2020 election. In fact, we're still debating this issue, whether the election was stolen, whether it was legitimate, and you see the impact that occurs from the disinformation that is released regarding these kinds of issues. Now, I've shown you some of the particular techniques an adversary may mount to do this. Many of them are cyber related, which is why you need to be defending your individual computer systems, the voter registration systems, machines that are tabulating. So let's talk now about really what ended up happening in 2020. In March 16th of 2021, that is after the election, Department of Justice and Homeland Security confirmed their findings that they found no evidence that foreign government-affiliated actors had prevented voting, changed votes, or disrupted the ability to tally votes or transmit those votes. However, they did find evidence of several incidents when Russian, Chinese, and Iranian government-affiliated actors did materially impact the security of networks associated with or pertaining to U.S. political organizations. And this could have been things leading into really that first column, attempts to manipulate voters, attempts to manipulate campaign messaging so that voters get an incorrect impression. So we saw the third column, they didn't find evidence of that. That first column that I showed you before, they found incidents. Now, why, given this, should we consider cybersecurity to be so important? Well, in that same time frame, we learned of significant successful attacks on government and corporate systems. One example was a SolarWinds breach. Another was a Microsoft Exchange server email breaches. These have been blamed, respectively, on Russian and Chinese hacking groups. Now, these kinds of attacks didn't, but they could easily have spread to the election infrastructure. And you can be certain that those seeking to compromise that infrastructure are going to keep trying. Now, personally, I believe one of the reasons SolarWinds didn't affect our election infrastructure, even though it affected so much other government infrastructure, was the level of isolation that was afforded to the systems used to count ballots. And as we went around to those 50 states, speaking to all the secretaries of state, one thing we heard over and over again was the measures that they were taking to provide isolation to those particular computers. And that actually worked. And that's an important computer security technique, among many others that I'm going to talk about in the slides that follow. Okay, so we see what adversaries tried to do. We see what they weren't able to accomplish, at least last time around. Let's understand how the adversaries try to accomplish some of these kinds of attacks. What are the things that they exploit? Well, one of them is exploiting poor password management, maybe through phishing or easy to guess passwords. We're going to speak about that in a moment. Sometimes they use malicious code. It's your viruses, it's your worms, it's your ransomware, other things that are intended to run on systems and compromise the security thereof. We'll talk a little bit about that. Sometimes they use social engineering. And by the way, phishing is one example of a social engineering technique used to trick users into doing things that are unsafe, that allows adversaries into your system. Sometimes they simply steal unprotected data, whether it is stolen laptop computer or listening over the network in a free hotspot at a restaurant or at an airport, for example. And finally, a lot of these attacks are mounted through disinformation and misinformation campaigns. You're going to hear about that from another speaker later in the session. So what should we be doing to defend our systems? Well, one of the techniques we use in computer security is what we call defense in depth. You should think of this like a fortress. You've got an outer gatehouse, you've got a moat, an outer wall, an inner sort of lawn, another gate, and maybe an inner courtyard. And if you've got sensitive information, maybe that data is in a locked safe and locked room that is accessible only from that inner courtyard. The idea is an adversary getting through one of these defenses still has more to get through before they're able to accomplish the goals of their attack. Now let's look at what some of these particular defenses are. The first one I just told you, that outer gatehouse, you can think of as really passwords. That's usually our first line of defense to control who is able to get into our systems. Now there are some problems with passwords. We'll start with the fact that we call it a password. Adversaries already have lists of all the words that are out there. It's called the dictionary. And if you think it's hard for them to type all this in to get into your system, they don't have to type it in. There are programs that will try millions of these words a second, and they get in pretty quickly. So the first thing you should think about is if you're using passwords, well, upgrade them a little bit. Change them to passphrases. And here's how you do that. Think up a phrase like, keep them out of our systems. And then change some of the letters in there, change some things to numbers, add some punctuation to make it even harder for an adversary to simply guess. This is actually a pretty good way to come up with a password. Please don't use this one here, though, because it's in my slides. Believe me, the adversaries have seen these slides, and they've added it to their dictionary. But use this approach. Come up with a phrase that makes sense to you. Do these modifications and use that as your passphrase. But just as important, don't use the same passphrase on all your accounts. Why not? You probably heard about a lot of data breaches recently. You can go back to the Yahoo email data breach, where there are databases out there of all the usernames and passwords of users of Yahoo. And guess what? If you use your Yahoo password on your voter registration system or your bank account, the criminals are going to find that database from Yahoo. They're going to find your username there. They're going to plug that username into this more critical system, and they're going to use the same password that was leaked in that breach. So this is why it's important to use a different password and a different passphrase on each system that you are using that has anything that is critical with respect to it, whether it's your bank, whether it's your voter registration systems, whether it is your campaign emails, whether it is anything else that is sensitive in any way. So we've spoken about sort of passwords as that first line of defense. There are many other ways that adversaries get hold of your passwords. Some of these through what we call social engineering attacks. And one of these social engineering attacks that we call phishing. It's a method of gathering personal information, such as passwords, using deceptive emails or websites or apps or text messages. And the basic way this works is you get an email, it's got a link in it, you click on that link, it brings you to a site that looks like a website you want to log into, you enter your username and password, but guess what? It wasn't the real site, you have just given that information to the adversary. And then they access your account, or they download malicious software to your computer, and all bets are off. Your system has now been compromised. Now, how effective is phishing? Well, everyone's a target, including you, including me. I probably get about 100 phishing emails per day. And it is the number one way that hackers gain access to systems. And of the most believable of the phishing sites, they trick almost half the users. And the hackers move fast. 20% of the time, they are into your account within 30 minutes of obtaining your credentials through the phishing attack. So the takeaway here is you got to be careful. You got to think before you click on a link. And if there is any question about the legitimacy of that link, you should call the sender of the message. Ask them, did you really send this link? Is it a site that I should be visiting? But don't call them at a phone number that's in the message itself, because if it's a fake message containing a fake link, it probably also contains a fake phone number And you call that phone number, and guess who you're speaking to? You're speaking to the hacker. Okay, so call them at the number on the back of your credit card. Call them at the number on the back of your authentication credential, or call them at the number that's in your address book obtained from your organization. Now, what does one of these phishing emails look like? Well, let's look at the message on the left here. Suppose you get a message from Google telling you that someone has your password. Okay, what's your reaction going to be? It's going to be a little bit of fear. That's what triggers the response that we call social engineering. The adversary intended for you to have the response of fear, and then the immediate thought that you have to do something quickly in order to prevent that user from doing anything more. And what's the quickest thing you can do? Oh, okay, let me quickly change my password. Well, how do I do that? I could hunt around to find the right way to do that. Or, hey, here's a simple way. I click the change password button, that's a link, in the email message, and I click it, I'm brought to a website that looks like Google login, so I happily enter my username and password. I'm about to change it anyway, but guess what? No one had your password when you received that message. That message was a fake message. Someone has your password now because you just entered it into this fake site. That's basically how phishing works. Now, we tell people a lot of things to look for in messages to tell if there are signs that it's phishing. One of the things we tell you, hover over the link before you click on it, see if it's taking you to where you actually expect to go. But that's fraught with errors as well. Suppose you hover over this link and you see it's taking you to myaccount.google.com. You think, okay, that makes sense. That's where I should be going. Except not so fast. The real name of the computer you were going to might have started myaccount.google.com, but it ended ml-security.org. And that's a site I've never heard of. Looks fishy to me. So you've been sort of tricked by just the arbitrary text that the adversary has put in the beginning of that link. We also tell you to look at the from address, but that is easily spoofed in email in many ways. So basically understand that hackers often look to send emails that look legitimate. So it's important to check the sender and destination of any embedded links, but don't believe that you're going to do this successfully. If you want to see just how hard it is, go to this site here. It's a phishing quiz. You'll be presented with 10 messages or 10 emails, and you're supposed to identify which are legitimate and which are phishing. I'll tell you, when I took this quiz, I only got 9 out of 10 correct. If I was wrong 10% of the time, imagine how wrong you're going to be most of the time. It should tell you just how hard it is to pick up on this kind of attack. So at this point, you should figure passwords are not a good way to determine your identity. And you'd be right. There are better approaches that are out there, and some of them are things you may be familiar with. One of these is two-factor authentication, otherwise called multi-factor authentication. You're probably already familiar with this. You log into your bank from a device that isn't recognized by your bank, and your bank sends you a text message with a code that you need to enter into the website. The first factor in that case was the username and password that you entered, but you're required to enter a second factor here that is proving you're in possession of a piece of hardware. So that is something you have, a second factor. Now, this is better than passwords alone, but understand that text messages can still be intercepted. In fact, a common way that this is done is, how many times have you installed an app on your smartphone and it asked for permission to access your text messages? If you clicked yes, and if that was a malicious app, well, guess what? Now, when you get the text from your bank, that app is forwarding the text to the adversary, where the adversary can use that to counter that second factor of authentication. Now, there are some other approaches to second factors of authentication that are a little bit better. There's Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator. You get a code for each of the sites that you visit that changes on a minute-by-minute basis. Even better, some of these apps like Duo, and there are some other ones like this as well, but the way this works is, at the end of the semester, I log into our grading system to enter grades for students. And I'm asked for a username and password. I enter that. But the system then opens a connection through the cellular network to my smartphone, that pops up this display on the screen of my smartphone, and I have to click the approve button on my cell phone, actually allow that login to proceed. So that's yet a better form of second factor of authentication. And then you've got tokens, USB keys. You put this on your key ring, but you plug it into the USB port of your computer when you are there and when you are using it. And this takes part in what we call a cryptographic exchange to prove identity, but utilizing a processor and memory actually on this chip itself, not utilizing your laptop or desktop computer for that component. And that's even stronger because it's resilient against even certain kinds of malicious code that might have infected your system. So this is one of the ways that adversaries try to get into your systems. These are some of the ways that you can defend against. You should be trying to use second factors of authentication whenever possible. But there are other ways that adversaries get into your system. One of these is malicious code. That is your computer virus. Ransomware is an example of malicious code that may be downloaded to your system. And in the case of ransomware, the contents of your system might be locked, or they might be filtrated, sent out, and then a ransom is demanded, not to leak the data or to return your data. Now, you really want to avoid malicious code from ending up installed on your system, but it's important to understand how it gets onto your system to begin with. Typically, it's installed on computers because, well, maybe you clicked on a bad link in a phishing email, and when you visited that website automatically downloaded software, which then started to execute automatically because maybe your browser or your operating system software, iOS, Android, Windows, etc., might have had vulnerabilities in it that had not been patched yet. This is why it is important that you keep your software for your operating system and your browsers up to date so that the newest attacks that might have been fixed end up fixed on your system, preventing some of this malicious code from ending up installed. Now, there are other ways that malicious code ends up installed on your system. Maybe it was when you downloaded supposedly free software for your phone, for your desktop, for your laptop computer. And maybe that didn't come from the authoritative site of the vendor. You thought, oh, great, a free version of this game that I would have had to pay for otherwise. Well, the only reason it's free is once it starts running on your system, you're going to end up paying that ransom. Other cases, it could be these free USB drives you get at trade shows, or maybe even at a political convention. Someone sets a table outside the auditorium with a bunch of thumb drives on it. Maybe it's even got your candidate's name painted on the thumb drive. Hey, wow, that looks like something nice to take. You plug it into your computer, and all of a sudden your system ends up infected. So you need to be careful of the origin of any of the devices that you're going to plug into your system. Okay, so what do you need to do here? First of all, always download apps only from trusted sources. For your smartphone, maybe it's from Apple. If it's an Android device, maybe from the Google Play Store. If it is for your desktop or laptop computer, only for Microsoft or Adobe or whatever the official organization is that is providing that software. But beyond that, install only the apps that you really need, because each new app is a potential risk. And believe me, if you have 40 apps installed on your smartphone, that's way too many. There's no way that you know all the things that are being done by each and every one of those apps. Okay, let me wrap up here by talking about some of the things that you can do to protect your communications, to protect your data and your systems, especially in light of working from home or working on the road, things that we're starting to do a lot more of now. First of all, you should use your organization's virtual private network to encrypt and scramble the data between your device and your organization's boundary. There are other VPNs that you might be considering, maybe provided by your ISP or your internet security suite, and they're probably okay to use, but not as good as using your organization's VPN, because if you use those other VPNs, it only encrypts the data as far as they exist, and then it's sent out in the clear on the rest of the internet to get back to your organization. Above all, don't use those VPNs that you see advertised in banner ads or by searching for free VPN on the internet in search engines. Why? A bunch of them are run by either organized crime or by nation state actors that want you to send all your sensitive data to them to look through before they forward it on. So some are fine, but you really can't be using these free versions. Don't use the same systems for entertainment, watching videos, playing games as you're using for sensitive data. Why not? Because each of them is a potential path for an adversary to get into your system. And be conscious of where you store your sensitive data. Again, store it in the facilities provided by your organization. Don't use the free cloud storage services. Using the enterprise versions of those provided by your organization is probably fine. If you're using the free versions of these, understand that it's much easier for an adversary through phishing or other social engineering to get into your account on that system and obtain all the sensitive data you're storing there as well. Finally, when using the internet to visit websites, chat, voice, video, things like Zoom here, you want to be using encryption. In the case of something like chat or video, if at all possible, use end-to-end encryption. So the data is protected all the way from the device of the sender to the device of the person that is viewing it. When you're using websites, you want to be using secure socket layer or transaction layer security. That is, the URL starts HTTPS, and you'll see a lock icon on your browser. That will protect the data between your device and the intermediate server, but not necessarily beyond that point. As I told you already, be vigilant about the links you use, the software, and the apps. Finally, for data at rest on your local laptop computer, you want to be careful that someone doesn't simply steal your computer as you're going through airport security, or steal your cell phone and get data that's on your cell phone. The best thing to do there is to use whole device encryption. That would be whole disk encryption on your laptop or even your desktop computer at home. All of our operating systems support that. Unfortunately, it is not turned on by default. If you don't know that you're using this, ask your IT staff for help getting that set up. For your smartphones, fortunately, modern smartphones are applying whole memory encryption for the data on the device. But to be effective there, you need to be using an effective passcode. Don't disable the passcode. Don't choose a passcode of 1, 2, 3, 4. In any event, that should help you improve the security of your systems. I hope I've given you enough information to improve your cyber hygiene.